Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. Happy New Year! My first video of 2025 is a compilation of some true crime stories dating back to as far as 1880. So please get yourself comfortable and sit and listen to my latest video of old true crime cases. Thanks very much to everyone that commented on my last video. The seasonal wishes to each other were a joy to read. On the 8th of January, I will be back with a brand new case. So please subscribe with notifications on so that you don't miss it. Thanks for the support. And now on with today's story. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be visiting Northern Ireland to look at the life of Fanny Barber. Fanny was born in Londonderry in 1884. In 1912, at the age of 28, she married a man by the name of William Barber. William was 30 years her senior, having been born in Sligo in 1854. William served the city of Belfast during the 1886 riots and was later appointed to the Central Police Office in 1895. 3 years before their marriage, which was William's second marriage, he retired from the police force and started working as a rent collector. The couple began their married life living in Jocelyn Gardens, Belfast, before moving to nearby Woodstock Road. A final move followed in the October of 1921 to live in Coltra near Holywood. William and Fanny were a hard-working couple who did not have any children together, although William had a son and daughter from his previous marriage. Their niece, Isabella Martin, who was in her 20s, began living with them in early December 1933. On Christmas Eve 1933, Fanny, William and Isabella were visited by a lady called Mrs. Dornan, who needed to pay some rent to William. Mrs. Dornan left the house at around 8:20 p.m. She was going to catch a bus, and Isabella accompanied her to the bus stop. Fanny and William stood at the front door to wave the two ladies off. When Isabella returned home approximately 45 minutes later, the house was very quiet. She rang the doorbell and knocked on the front door, but no one answered. As Isabella continued to ring the doorbell, she heard Fanny calling her from an upstairs window. Fanny informed Isabella that there had been a rough-looking man at the house and that Isabella should come in through the back door. However, before Isabella could do so, Fanny came down and met her at the side of the house. The two women went back inside, but the house was dark, so Isabella suggested that they went to get their neighbour, Mr. Conlin, to help them. When Mr. Conlin asked what was wrong, Fanny asked him if he had seen a strange man prowling around the back of her house. Mr. Conlin said that he had not. She then asked if he had heard anyone or anything unusual. Mr. Conlin replied that he had just been startled by some loud noises. Fanny stated that she knew Mr. Conlin would have heard the man, and then added that she believed that the strange man may have been hiding in her garage. The two women, together with Mr. Conlin, went back into Fanny's house, and as they walked through the garage, Fanny said that her darling was in the hallway and that she was concerned that the scoundrel was still in her house. As she approached the hallway door, she told Mr. Conlin to come and see her poor darling, repeatedly asking, "Who could have done this to my poor darling?" Upon seeing William, both Fanny and Isabella became hysterical and inconsolable. William had been shot dead. His body was lying in the hallway, partly against the front door, preventing it from opening. His right arm was stretched out in front of him, and his revolver was balanced on his forearm, with the muzzle pointing towards his hand. He had been shot twice. The police were called, and Sergeant Patton, together with a doctor, arrived at the house at around 9:30 p.m. The police sergeant took possession of the weapon and found that it contained 2 live cartridges and 3 spent cartridges. One of the loaded cartridges had misfired. The sergeant, doctor and Mr. Conlin carried William's body through into the dining room where the doctor examined him. William had 2 bullet wounds, one at the back of his left ear, which had been fired at close range, and another in his chest. It was established that he had been killed with his own gun. It was noted that William was still wearing his gold watch and was found to have £46, 3 shillings and 4 pence on his person. This made it extremely unlikely that the motive was robbery. Additionally, there was no sign of there being a struggle in the house. On Tuesday the 26th of December, Fanny was taken to Downpatrick Mental Health Facility for treatment. She remained at this facility until the 18th of May 1934, when she moved to a private nursing home in Belfast. 4 months later, on the 22nd of September 1934, Sergeant Patton arrived at the nursing home and arrested Fanny for William's murder. When cautioned, she simply replied, "Oh, Sergeant, you know I didn't do it." Later that day, she appeared before the resident magistrate in Belfast and was remanded to Armagh Prison for 8 days whilst further investigations were being completed. During the hearing, it was established that Fanny was in a rather nervous state of health, and as such her defence requested that she should be granted bail. This was refused. A second request, that Fanny was placed under arrest at the nursing home, was also refused. A third request was then made that, as Fanny was a woman of refinement and in a precarious state of health, that she should not be taken away in the prison van, but instead a private taxi. This request was granted. At the time in Northern Ireland, the most serious criminal offences were heard at the Court of Assizes. Fanny's case would be heard at the Winter Assizes in Derry in December 1934. After a 2-day trial, the jury were unable to agree a verdict, so the case was scheduled to be retried at the Spring Assizes to be held in Downpatrick the following March. The second trial began on the 11th of March 1935 before the Right Honourable Lord Justice Andrews. After a problem with jury selection due to one of the sworn-in jurors being the brother of one of the junior defence team members, a second jury was sworn in and the trial got underway. The prosecution presented the case that Fanny had murdered her husband because she feared that he was going to write her out of his will and leave everything to his children from his first marriage. They made several compelling arguments. Firstly, that Fanny had been in the house at the time of the murder and there was no evidence to support that anyone else had been there. They stated that the motive for the murder was not robbery, as William was still wearing his watch and had money on his person after he was killed. The prosecution also made a lot of references to Fanny's behaviour on the night of the murder being both inconsistent and very strange. Her story continued to change and develop as the minutes and hours passed. They said that if there had actually been an intruder with a gun in her house, would she have really asked her niece to go around to the back to enter the house? They also questioned why there had been no attempt to raise an alarm until after her niece returned. During a police interview in the hours after the murder, Fanny reportedly told a police constable that her husband was a mean man and that she was concerned that he was going to write her out of his will. She went on to state that she feared that everything she had built up during their marriage would be taken from her and given to his children. The prosecution also provided details of a recent life insurance policy which would pay Fanny £300, which is the equivalent to around £22,000 today, in the event of William's death. Prosecutors also highlighted the many inconsistencies and changes to her story in the months that followed the murder. During cross-examination, Fanny claimed that she could not remember many of the events of that night, nor conversations she had had, or even that she had made and signed a statement. The defence countered these arguments with an entirely different explanation of events. They said that William had been killed by an intruder in an aborted robbery attempt. Whilst they acknowledged that his gold watch and over £46 had been left on William's body, they stated that his rent book, which could potentially have contained additional money, was missing. Fanny testified that as William was about to sit down in his armchair in the kitchen to listen to the radio, the back door suddenly opened and a man rushed in. The man tried to grab her, but she ran upstairs and locked herself in her bedroom. She heard shots being fired, but then collapsed and did not regain consciousness until she heard her niece persistently ringing the doorbell. She described the man, who did not speak, as being around 40 to 50 years old, burly looking, with a red face and small moustache. He was wearing an old grey suit, a tweed cap pulled down over his eyes, and a brown scarf. The defence then speculated that William had probably run to the hallway to grab his revolver, which the intruder had managed to get off of him. As William ran to the front door, he was shot twice. Again, some compelling arguments were made to support this theory. Isabella, William and Fanny's niece, testified that the couple seemed happy together. There had been no issues between them on the night of the murder, and whilst they would occasionally argue, this was no more than what would be seen in any marriage. She could not provide any information relating to possible changes to William's will, nor did she believe that the couple were having any disagreements about their finances. The defence's most notable argument was the height difference between Fanny and William. It had already been established that the two shots that killed William had been fired with a downward trajectory. The defence argued that William was over 6 feet, or 1.8 metres tall, whilst Fanny was just 4 foot 2 inches, or 1.3 metres, making it impossible for her to have fired the shots. At the end of the evidence, at the request of her defence team, Fanny was allowed to stand next to Sergeant Patton, who was of similar build to her husband. It was noted that the top of her head barely reached the sergeant's shoulders. Additionally, one of the shots had been fired at very close range, and there was no blood on Fanny. The defence went on to argue that all evidence against Fanny was circumstantial and that she should be acquitted. On 12th of March 1935, the jury deliberated for just 50 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty, together with a recommendation for mercy. However, Fanny was sentenced to death with an execution date set for less than a month later. The date was set for the 5th of April 1935. As the verdict was announced, Fanny collapsed onto the floor of the dock, screaming hysterically. A doctor was brought in to administer some medication and help her regain her composure. After half an hour, she was lifted back into her chair, but when she saw the judge assume the black cap, she became hysterical once again. She was carried from the dock, still struggling and screaming. The black cap was worn by judges in Northern Ireland passing death sentences until the death penalty was abolished by the Northern Ireland Emergency Provisions Act of 1973. The following week there was a petition for her reprieve, and shortly afterwards her sentence was commuted to life in prison. I've been unable to find exact details regarding what happened to her after this. One report has said that she was released from prison in September 1942, while another states that she remained incarcerated until her death in 1952. She did, however, maintain her innocence until the day she died. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Was Fanny innocent or guilty of the murder of William Barber? Psst, did you know in the late 19th century, Belfast was the world's largest producer of linen? It was sometimes referred to as Linenopolis. Hugo Ignaz Rudolf Schenk was born on February the 11th, 1849, in the small town of Czechi pod Koszirem, located in what was then the Austrian Empire, but now falls inside the Czech Republic. This town, that is currently home to approximately 1,000 inhabitants, is located 200 kilometres north of Vienna, which is Austria's capital. Hugo's family was said to be fairly well off. His father, Wilhelm, was a judge who sadly passed away when Hugo was just a young boy. His brother, Karl Schenk, became a local doctor, though he would later be distracted by Hugo's criminal schemes and ideas. Hugo's mother had hopes that her son would become an engineer. He had the potential and knowledge to be a successful man, but often showed signs of being untruthful, devious, and dishonest, which made him a frustrating child to teach. He spent a lot of time in a military school and did not get on with his fellow classmates. They described him as a bully and a liar. His first job, at 21 years old, was as an apprentice for a manufacturer. Hugo showed his true colours by stealing from the man early on. He was caught and arrested. Hugo was then sentenced to 5 years in prison, but due to him being such a young age, he was released after serving only 2 years in jail. After his time behind bars, Hugo set his sights on befriending a wealthy businessman. He successfully got a job as a bookkeeper for the potential Mark and used his charms to integrate himself into the family. He did such a good job infiltrating the family that 24-year-old Hugo was given permission to marry a relative of the family. She was an intelligent and upstanding woman who worked as the family's governess and was responsible for teaching other children in the huge house. His job as a bookkeeper had Hugo travelling to different towns on a regular basis. Despite having a happy marriage to the governess, Hugo found himself having affairs in almost every town that he visited. Hugo presented himself as a tall, wealthy, well-spoken bachelor and proposed marriage to these women for his own monetary benefit, one of whom gave him 500 florins, the standard coinage used across Europe at the time. When this woman realised that she had been tricked by Hugo, she went to the police. Hugo was with his wife when he was arrested. He was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment for the fraud. His young wife went back to her job as a governess and teacher. She wanted nothing more to do with him, but she had 300 florins for him once he was released. This was a gesture on her part for him to go off and start his life again once getting out of prison, but she did not want to be in contact with him ongoing. Whilst in prison, Hugo was kept in a cell with Karl Schlosserek, who was serving time for stealing. These two began scheming, and once they were released, the pair headed to Vienna. Using the money that his ex-wife had given him, Hugo and Karl set up a business. The premise was simple. Adverts were posted in local newspapers looking for young men who sought employment. After luring them out on the false promise of a job, the job seeker would be robbed. The first instance of this didn't go well for Karl. This victim proved too much for the thief, and he was almost fatally wounded, while Hugo watched from a distance. However, they took a different approach with their second victim, who was drugged in a forest before having his money stolen. Unfortunately for the two criminals, Karl and Hugo, the money they gained from this assault was negligible. This had them reconsidering and going back to the drawing board for better ways to make money. They changed tack, and they then decided to target women. Again, placing an advert in a local paper, Hugo posted a fake advert looking for a housekeeper. It didn't take long before they had their first victim, Josephine Timal. She was 34 years old and thought she had struck the jackpot with the dashing Hugo Schenk. Hugo soon had her in his grips and convinced her that marriage was on the horizon. Josephine told Hugo that she had 300 florins saved, which he could have if his intentions were honourable. Hugo made Josephine write a letter to her aunt, Catherine, who had 1,000 florins saved up for her niece. This money was sent immediately after the wedding ceremony, addressed to Josephine. After they were married, Hugo and Josephine went on their honeymoon to a small town where some of Hugo's relatives lived. Hugo's friend Karl, that was the one that he met at the prison, was on the same train, along with Hugo's brother, Karl Schenk. Josephine was never seen again. Karl was responsible for the murder, and some reports suggest that Hugo's brother was also involved by holding Josephine down as Karl cut her throat. Josephine's lifeless body was then tied down and thrown into a nearby river. Her body was never recovered. Hugo then made his way back to Vienna, with plans already forming for his next victim. He soon received the 1,000 florins from Josephine's aunt in the post. This is when Hugo decided to write back to the aunt, offering her a place to stay. Hugo told her about a small country house and farm that he had purchased, which was not actually true. He added that Josephine would likely not be able to visit her, as she would be busy tending to him and the home. The aunt, Catherine, received the letter and then decided to sell her possessions and arrived in Vienna a few weeks later with 3,000 florins in her possessions, along with trunks of her remaining items. Hugo met her at the station. Catherine was jovial and excited about her niece's good fortune of finding such a wealthy man who would care for her. Catherine spent one night at the hotel before meeting up with Hugo and Carl, who was pretending to be an acquaintance, and the group then went to a remote village. Whilst on the train that night, the men convinced Catherine to drink far more wine than she would normally consume, and she ended up worse for wear, and once she was drunk and they had arrived at their destination, they led Catherine up a path to a large rock face. Since she was intoxicated and elderly, Catherine stood little chance against these two men. Carl proceeded to tie a large stone to her waist before pushing her off the rock and into the water below. Catherine's body was found some months later by tourists who walked that same path. In normal circumstances, Carl and Hugo may have been caught at this point, but if not for a stroke of luck, they were permitted to carry on. For some reason, Catherine and Josephine's relatives failed to report them missing for 6 months, leaving Hugo and Carl to continue their crime spree. But after Catherine's murder, there was a split between the two men. Hugo was the mastermind behind it all, and while Carl did the dirty work, Hugo found it hard to give him his share of Catherine's goods, wanting to try and rather keep it all for himself. It was this revelation that led him to attempt the next murder on his own. Hugo's next victim was an older Bavarian cook, Theresa Kettel. She had been left to mind her boss's home whilst he was away and had a stash of valuables and 2,000 florins saved. This would make her an ideal target for Hugo. When he offered Theresa a 3-day trip with him, she readily agreed. Before leaving, Hugo told her about a recent spate of break-ins of empty houses. Because of this, he advised that she bring her valuables with her on their short holiday. After travelling by rail to a remote spot, Hugo took Theresa out for a picnic. They found a shady spot where they enjoyed wine together, though Hugo made sure she was drinking far more than he was. At this point, he pulled out his pistol and showed it to her, making it clear that the weapon was unloaded. In her intoxicated state, she took the gun and began playing with it and pulling the trigger. It is unclear whether Hugo had planned what he did next in advance or thought of it in the actual moment. He walked off to pick Theresa some flowers, and when he was far enough away, Hugo put a bullet in the chamber of his pistol. He then handed her the gift of some wild flowers and the pistol, saying that she should keep it. Not knowing that the gun was any different than before, Theresa pointed the pistol towards her face and pulled the trigger. Her body was never found. Hugo then made his way back to Vienna with Theresa Kettel's goods in hand. He went out to a meal with friends, remarking to them that he had done a hard day's work and worked up quite the appetite. It was here that Hugo began talking to Emily Hoxman, a woman who had previously caught his attention. Proving that he would just about do anything, Hugo used the jewels that he had stripped from Theresa's dead body just hours earlier as a gift to charm Emily. But Emily was different. For some reason, Hugo saw her differently to the other women that he had preyed upon. When he invited her on a trip to Switzerland, she made it out alive after enjoying a holiday that was funded by Theresa's money. Once his funds began to dry up, Hugo went back to his Viennese hunting grounds. 2 potential victims soon presented themselves, once again through an advert placed in the paper. The first was Rosa Ferenczi, a young Hungarian girl who was the daughter of a nobleman. Like others had before her, Rosa fell victim to Hugo's charm. On December the 20th, Hugo left for Pressburg, which is now known as modern-day Bratislava. On the trip to Pressburg, Rosa travelled with Hugo, for what she believed was going to be their wedding. Sadly, unbeknownst to her, Hugo had an old friend accompanying him, Karl Schlosserek. Whilst walking along the Danube, Karl came up behind Rosa and struck her with a hatchet. She lost consciousness, only coming to after she had been stripped of her items and thrown into the river. Later, her body was found in the Danube. Taking his share of the money, Hugo headed to Salzburg to meet with Emily. He spent a week with her before travelling back to Vienna for what would ultimately be his final crime. The second woman that Hugo had tricked was a maid called Josephine. She worked for Baroness Malfatti. The Baroness was a generous and kind woman. She used her wealth to help others, founding an asylum for elderly women that she maintained. Hugo convinced Josephine to leave one of the villa's windows open on the night of January the 8th. Hugo told Josephine that he would dose everyone in the house with morphine, herself included, to avoid suspicion, so he and his accomplices could ransack the home. In actuality, Hugo planned to murder them all. Had he not been arrested, 4 more people would have been added to his death toll. Baroness Malfatti trusted Josephine, who had worked for her for 12 years. Because they had built up this trust, Baroness Malfatti didn't even notice that an expensive pearl necklace went missing, and it was Hugo that had convinced Josephine to steal it, and then they could split the 3 pearls among other girls that he was courting. Finally, Hugo Schenk was arrested by police on January the 10th, 1884, and soon admitted to everything that he had done. He told detectives that he had 4 more young women lined up who had all agreed to go away with him under his usual ruse that they were to be married. Hugo estimated that he would get around 30,000 florins from these women. With this money he planned to use to run away with Emily to America. Emily knew nothing of Hugo's past crimes. She too had been fooled by him. Eventually, Emily became the principal witness to testify against her former lover. Hugo Schenk, his brother Karl Schenk, and Karl Schlosserek were all found guilty of murder and sentenced to be hanged. Karl Schenk was set to be killed first, then Karl Schlosserek, and finally the mastermind of it all, Hugo Schenk. However, before they were taken to the gallows, Karl Schenk was pardoned by the Emperor Wilhelm II, as his role was determined to be lesser than his brother and Karl Schlosserek. Instead, Karl Schenk was sentenced to life imprisonment. On the 22nd of April 1884, 200 people gathered to witness the execution. Karl Schlosserek stepped up first. He had been waiting for his family to arrive and say their last goodbyes for the whole day, but they never showed up. His wife had sent him some flowers, which he held as the noose was placed around his neck. Karl's last words were begging for forgiveness from God. Just 2 minutes later, Hugo was brought out and hanged. He remained composed throughout. Hugo Schenk and Karl Schlosserek were buried in an unmarked grave. Before being buried, Hugo's head was removed and examined. His skull is still viewable today in the Criminal Museum in Vienna, Austria. Psst, the writer, Egon Kisch, has dealt with the story of a woman who survived Schenk's attack in his short story book entitled A Woman Waits for Hugo Schenk. I have a fascinating historical story for you today that took place back in 1933. This story was brought to my attention by Delphine Singal, an associate professor at the University of Paris. This story is partly based upon an article that she had published in the book Sisters Born, Sisters Found, a diversity of voices on sisterhood. In this book, 76 writers provide a diverse and compelling collection of short stories, essays, poems and memoirs looking at sisterhood from every angle, including murder. I will include a link to this book in the comments section below. So I will start today's story with Delphine's words. "A bloody eye on the stairs." Those words were my first encounter with the Papin Sisters, and I was about 9 years old. Somehow, one of my classmates had found out about these two sordid murderesses from a faraway past and had told me. For me, especially as a child, it was too gruesome for words, and I must admit I had long suspected my friend of having told me a tall tale. Alas, she had not. The only mistake she had made in relating the true-life tale was that the eye had not been wrenched out with a spoon, as she had told me, but with bare hands. The hands of two sisters who had probably gone mad. The day was February the 2nd, 1933. Mr. René Lancelot, a solicitor and insurance broker, returned to his home at number 6 Rue Bruère in Le Mans, France, and found that the door was locked and bolted from the inside. He had plans that evening with his wife, Léonie, and their 20-year-old daughter, Geneviève, to go to dinner at his brother-in-law's house at number 3 Rue de Chanoine. René checked with his brother-in-law, but the two women had not arrived. Concerned and unable to get into his own home, René called the police. The commissaire arrived with 2 police officers and a clerk. In a strange twist, the 2 police officers' names were Ragot, which translates to gossip, and Vérité, which means truth. Truth is what everyone would be looking for, and gossip is what they would find. The scene that greeted the police after they broke in through the back door was unimaginable. First, an eye on the stairs, then the corpses of the lady of the house and her daughter, both killed and slashed. Both women had had their eyes wrenched out while they were still alive, been knocked unconscious, had their thighs and legs lacerated, and eventually had bled to death. The family's 2 maids, sisters Christine and Léa Papin, were found sitting in their beds after having cleaned themselves up and changed into new nightwear. As the police entered the room, they calmly said, "We were waiting for you," and made no attempt to escape or resist arrest. Both sisters insisted that they had to defend themselves against their mistresses. Christine was 28 years old and Léa was 22. The 2 women's lives had been far from happy. They had an older sister, Emilia, who had been sexually abused by their father. When their mother found out about this, she separated from her husband, and soon after, Emilia would leave the family home to become a nun. Christine and Léa remained living with their mother, who seemed to lack any motherly instincts and failed to provide them with the care that they so desperately needed. Once the daughters were old enough, their mother would place them in various houses to work as maids. She would then take most of their earnings from them. Christine and Léa formed an extremely close bond, always looking out for each other. In 1926, when Christine was 21, she was hired as a cook in the Lancelot household. Within a couple of months, she had recommended Léa for a position as a maid, and for the first time, the pair worked together in the same house. Both Christine and Léa were well paid for rural France at that time, with René Lancelot going as far as providing these with insurance should they have any accident, another rarity of the time. The 2 women decided that they would no longer give their mother their earnings, and, as such, any contact with their family was completely severed. In 1931, after 5 years working for the Lancelot family, the sisters went to see the mayor of the city, apparently in a state of stress and confusion, accusing the Lancelots of ill treatment. However, the mayor sided with the Lancelot family, advising them to dismiss the 2 sisters. The family did not take this advice, mainly due to the fact that these sisters were such good workers. On Thursday, February the 2nd, 1933, the sisters had just had their iron repaired, and Christine was taking care of a pile of linen that needed ironing when a fuse blew and the house ended up in darkness. When their mistresses came home, Christine told them that the ironing was not finished, and this led to a fight. In the altercation that followed, both Leonie and Genevieve had their eyes purposefully removed. Then they were knocked out with a hammer and a tin pot and lacerated with knives by the two maids, who then proceeded to expose their victims' genitalia. When interviewed about the crime, the only explanation that the two sisters gave was that Leonie had become violent towards them. At first, the sisters insisted the murders were self-defense. Later on, after Leah had been put in a different prison cell and both sisters were finally separated, Christine recanted and admitted that she had attacked the two women and then had asked Leah for help. For every statement made by Christine, Leah only confirmed her sister's successive versions of the murders. After a trial lasting just 13 hours, during which the lawyers, Germaine Briere for Christine and Pierre Chaton for Leah, tried in vain to convince the jury that both women were insane, they were both found guilty as charged. 3 psychiatrists had declared them sane, but interestingly, one, Dr. Lonya, had asserted neither sister was guilty, but that the culprit was in fact the duo, when Christine and Leah were both put together. At the trial, Christine stood in the prisoner's box with her hands clasped together and downcast eyes. Leah stood staring fixedly in front of her, as if in a trance. Both women replied timidly, almost inaudibly, to any questions. They expressed no remorse and shed no tears. When the verdict was returned, they were quiet and impassive. Christine was sentenced to death, but at that time, the guillotine was considered as something women should not have to go through. So her sentence was commuted by President Albert Lebrun to life imprisonment. Leah was sentenced to 10 years hard labour and was not allowed to return to Le Mans for 20 years. It seems that there were 2 versions of the household conditions reported by the press. Whilst many talked of the respectable lawyer, the kindly Lancelot family, and the comparatively comfortable home in which the sisters lived, others talked of the horrors that they endured. At trial, it was identified how René had never once spoken to the sisters in their 7 years of service in his home, and that his wife and daughter only addressed them to order them about, scold and reprimand them. Each day after the sisters mopped the floors, beat the carpets and polished the furniture, Leonie would put on white gloves and make a tour of inspection, passing her hands over surfaces to see if a speck of dust remained. If it did, she would severely reprimand the girls, sometimes violently. During a previous incident, Leonie had dragged Leah to the floor, forcing her to pick up a small scrap of paper. Whilst there could never be any justification for their crimes, it may possibly provide us with some insight into their reasons behind it, something that neither woman ever spoke of. Gossip would circulate that the 2 sisters had become engaged in an incestuous relationship, speculating that the murder had happened because Leonie and Genevieve had caught them in a sexual act, that the sisters had wrenched out their mistress's eyes because of what they had seen. This speculation would seem extremely unlikely, as the family followed a very strict routine, and Leonie and Genevieve had returned home at their usual time. It would seem that the undeniable and indestructible bond between the 2 sisters was being misinterpreted as incest. Due to their upbringing with dreadful absent parents and working conditions as domestics where they were viewed as the lowest of the low, they had to become everything to each other: mother, father, sibling, spouse. But there is no evidence to support the theory that their relationship was in fact incestuous. After the trial, Christine's mental state deteriorated very quickly and she was institutionalized at a psychiatric hospital in Rennes. She only saw Leah once more, at which point she no longer recognized her. She stopped eating and died in 1937. In contrast, Leah was released from prison in 1943, after which she lived in Nantes with her mother. Using a pseudonym, she even found a job as a maid. She died at the age of 90 in 2001, outliving her sister by over 70 years. Psst, this case has inspired many other films, books, plays. The most recent reference was the 2019 South Korean film Parasite. I have a very special narration to share with you today. I was recently contacted by an author by the name of Charles Oldham. Charles is an attorney in Charlotte, North Carolina, and also the author of a book called The Senator's Son. This book is published by Beach Glass Books in Richmond, Virginia. It's about an 8-year-old boy named Kenneth Beasley who disappeared many years ago, very mysteriously, and still has never been found. Charles has provided us with a summary of this fascinating case to narrate today, and I have provided the relevant links below for anyone who would like to purchase his book. I would highly recommend it. So here is the story of The Senator's Son in the words of Charles Oldham. This story goes back more than a century to 1905. And it happened in Currituck County, not far from the Outer Banks on the North Carolina coast. Today, that area has a busy highway running through it, full of tourists heading to the beach. There are surf shops and waterfront marinas all over the place. But back in 1905, it was still the horse and buggy days, and Kenneth, the boy who went missing, lived on a farm in an isolated community near the waterfront. Everyone around lived by farming, fishing, and hunting ducks and geese. It takes some effort to imagine what the area looked like back then, but if you venture off the highway onto one of the side roads, as few of the beachgoers do, it does not take long to find that Carolina tidewater as it once was. You can still see old white farmhouses surrounded by fields, with the fields surrounded by woods. The Beasley family lived in one of them. There are wide front yards, most of them with a big oak tree or two, and many of them with a small family cemetery nearby. In the old days, farm families held onto the land and to each other. Few people cared to venture too far afield, even after death. One of those side roads leads a couple of miles to the tiny crossroads of Poplar Branch. This was where Kenneth lived with his parents and his older brother and sister. Once you're off the highway, back in the woods, the sounds of the traffic die away quickly. The road dips into the bottomland of the maple swamp, where dark water licks up against the trunks of sweet gum, maple and cypress trees, so thick that it is always a challenge to see even 10 feet in front of you. All around are shadows. Not just in the summer when the leaves grow thickly on the trees and the sunlight barely filters down to dapple the ground. Even on an overcast winter day, the light creates illusions. The grey tree bark casts its reflection onto the water, and you have to watch your step carefully. What you see might actually be a fallen limb, and it might be solid enough to support you, or it might not. It might also be one of the poisonous snakes which abound in the area. If you wanted to get lost in the woods, this would be an easy place to do it, especially if you were an 8-year-old boy like Kenneth. Or, just as well, if you wanted a boy to get lost in the woods and leave no trace, this spot could serve your purpose. It all began on Monday morning, February the 13th, 1905. Young Kenneth set out to walk the half-mile from his parents' farm to the 2-room country schoolhouse that he attended with the other local children. It was a cold and windy day with some snow still on the ground after a recent winter storm. He was dressed warmly in a grey suit with heavy coat, brown stockings, gloves and a blue cap. By all accounts, Kenneth was a bright, happy, well-liked 3rd grader. His teacher commented later to the newspapers about how much he enjoyed school and how well behaved he was. From family photos and from the missing child notices that were printed later, we know that he had blonde hair and blue eyes. He was a very cute kid, and in a later era his face would have been featured on many milk cartons and nightly news bulletins. He was also the child of an important local politician. Kenneth's father, Samuel Beasley, was the state senator who represented Currituck County in the North Carolina General Assembly. When Kenneth reached the schoolhouse, he was greeted by his teacher, Miss Nina Harrison. Miss Nina was a new teacher in her 20s and came from an even more prominent local family than Kenneth. Her father, Joshua Harrison, was a prosperous local farmer and landowner whose brother-in-law was Thomas Jarvis, a former governor of North Carolina and a United States senator. Once the class had gathered, Miss Nina led Kenneth and her other students through the morning lessons. By the time noonday recess arrived, the sun had come out and warmed the air quite a bit. Kenneth took off his heavy coat, left it in the closet, and headed out into the back schoolyard to play with the other boys. The schoolyard bordered onto the dark, shadowy depths of the maple swamp. When the school bell rang to summon the kids back to class, Kenneth turned to his cousin, Benny Walker, and he said, "I'm going back, Father." Without another word, Kenneth stepped off into the woods, never to be seen again. When Kenneth didn't return to class and the teachers realised he was lost in the swamp, they put out a call to all the men in the community to start searching. There was no time to lose because the weather had turned cloudy and cold again. Rain started to fall, which then turned to snow. They knew that Kenneth was without his coat and he would die from hypothermia if they didn't find him. Several dozen men gathered and they formed a dragnet to comb through the flooded woods. They searched on hands and knees through piles of brush and then poked with sticks into the dark, stagnant creeks, fearful that Kenneth might have slipped into the water and drowned. After several days, the searchers looked to the sky for buzzards, thinking that if Kenneth had died in the woods, the birds would lead them to the body, but none were seen. Newspapers throughout North Carolina and Virginia began to cover the story of the missing child, and as you'd expect, their descriptions were heartrending. Senator Beasley had to return home where the legislature was in session to comfort his distraught wife. Kenneth's mother was near collapse, taking sedatives and now and then crying out, "Give me the body of my boy." The searchers were surprised not to find the boy either dead or alive, and when they didn't, it caused them to wonder whether Kenneth really had, just by chance, gotten lost in the woods behind his schoolhouse. Had he been kidnapped? The rumour mill started to churn, and they focused immediately on one man in particular, Miss Nina's father, Joshua Harrison. It turned out that Joshua, even though he had married well and owned a lot of land, had a checkered past. Many described him as violent-tempered, a man who intimidated his neighbours. Now in his late 60s, with 5 grown children, Joshua had been charged with murder twice in his younger years. 30-some years earlier, he had been accused of killing his own father and also of shooting a young boy who was about the same age as Kenneth. But in both cases, juries had found him not guilty. Some suspected that his prominent brother-in-law helped him get off. Joshua was also well known in the community as a bootlegger who produced illegal wine on his farm. Some of the locals liked drinking his product, but most of them, in that evangelical era, disapproved of drinking, or at least claimed to disapprove. Senator Beasley recently had pushed legislation through the General Assembly to prohibit selling wine in Currituck County, and Joshua was reportedly angry about it. It might have given him a motive to take revenge on the senator by stealing his child. Plus, North Carolina politics in those days was just a nasty, brutal business all around. Reconstruction was over and white supremacists had recently taken control of the state government through a violent campaign of voter intimidation towards black people. Lynchings were almost a daily occurrence throughout the South in the early 1900s, and in 1898, the year that Senator Beasley was first elected to office, dozens of black people had been killed in a race riot in Wilmington, North Carolina. Life even the life of an innocent child was cheap when political power was at stake. So the newspapers started printing vague rumours from locals, and not all of them would speak for attribution. Some of the locals claimed to have seen a man who looked like Joshua on the day Kenneth disappeared. He was riding away from Poplar Branch in his mule-drawn buggy, accompanied by a young boy who looked like Kenneth, wearing brown stockings and a blue cap. It's not clear whether Senator Beasley took seriously the rumours that Joshua had snatched his son. Publicly, he told the papers that he believed someone had kidnapped Kenneth for money, but he did not know who, and he was waiting to receive a ransom demand. Yet, ransom kidnapping was almost unheard of in those days. By 1905, well before the gangster era of the 1930s, when kidnapping became a national epidemic, there had been only 2 confirmed cases of it anywhere in the United States. The first, the kidnapping of 4-year-old Charlie Ross in Philadelphia in 1874, became a national sensation and a heartbreak, as the boy was never found despite his parents' anguished searching. Then in 1900, Eddie Cudahy, the teenage son of a wealthy Omaha businessman, was kidnapped, but then released safely after his father paid the demanded ransom. That story might have encouraged a would-be kidnapper who thought he could quietly steal a child and collect a quick payoff. This is where the mystery gets very dark and shadowy. We don't know whether Joshua or anyone else approached Senator Beasley and tried to negotiate a ransom. No one was legally charged with the kidnapping until September 1906, which was 18 months after Kenneth disappeared. Senator Beasley contacted local prosecutors and swore out a warrant against Joshua Harrison for the crime. Joshua was locked up in the jail amid new rumours that he might be lynched before his trial. Why the long wait? As the senator told the story, it was not until then that Joshua contacted him through an intermediary and complained about how he had not yet offered up enough ransom for his son. Further, Joshua said it was really expensive to hold the boy captive for so long. In March 1907, Joshua went to trial in the old brick courthouse in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. The trial lasted a week and was by far the biggest spectacle in town. All newspapers agreed that the courthouse was jam-packed every day. 5 prosecutors handled the case for the state, and Joshua hired 4 defense attorneys of exceptional talent. 2 of them were former governors of the state, his brother-in-law, Thomas Jarvis, and Charles B. Aycock, who had left office just 2 years earlier. At the trial, Senator Beasley testified that Joshua had argued violently with him about the wine legislation shortly before Kenneth disappeared, and Joshua threatened to make him sorry. Several of the Beasleys' neighbours told the jury of how they saw the mysterious man, whom they now believed was Joshua, driving with the young boy in his buggy. Naturally, when the defence cross-examined them, they were asked why they had waited 1.5 years to tell their stories. It was just none of their business, one of them said. Joshua's wife, sons, and several other family members testified that he had been at home working in his fields the entire day when Kenneth went missing, so he couldn't have done it, they said. But those witnesses were obviously his relatives. Their bias was clear. Looking at this today, we would naturally have some doubts about how all of these various stories came together. By today's legal standards, they really should have found Joshua not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But nevertheless, the jury was convinced by the Beasley stories, and likely also their heartfelt grief at losing their child. The jurors deliberated for about 8 hours before finding Joshua guilty. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, but tearfully continued to proclaim his innocence. Joshua appealed his conviction, and the judge allowed him to remain out of jail on bond while it was heard. Former Governor Aycock made an impassioned speech before the North Carolina Supreme Court, But in the end, the court upheld the verdict and sentence. Joshua was staying in a hotel in Norfolk, Virginia, and police officers were dispatched there to take him into custody. When the officers knocked on the door of Joshua's room, he slammed the door in their face. Seconds later, they heard a gunshot. Joshua was found lying on the bed, a pistol by his side and a bullet hole in his forehead. He had finished a suicide note, still protesting his innocence, but saying he was an old man and couldn't face the prospect of spending his last years in prison. Kenneth was never found, and so mystery remained as deep, dark and shadowy as the Maple Swamp and the Blackwater Creeks of Currituck County. Was Joshua really such a sadistic character that he would murder an 8-year-old child in revenge for a local liquor ordinance? Had North Carolina politics really sunk to that level? Did Joshua's daughter, who surprisingly didn't testify at her father's trial, take part in luring her student into the woods to be abducted? Or did someone else steal the child away? Or, in a truly horrible miscarriage of justice for everyone, did the boy simply get lost in the woods, wander away and die from the cold, never to be discovered? I would like to say a huge thank you to Charles Oldham for providing this information for us to share today. In his book, The Senator's Son, he provides the first thoroughly researched account of this fascinating story. It covers all the angles, from the newspaper accounts to the trial records, to the deed books, as well as a scientific analysis of the scene of the disappearance. He puts forth a plausible theory for what happened and comes as close as anyone can to the final answer. The book is published by Beach Glass Books, and I've included the relevant links below if you would like to purchase a copy for yourself. It's available in hard paper versions or electronically. As always, I would really like to hear your thoughts and feedback on this case. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. The Outer Banks of North Carolina are famous for wild horses that live on some of the beaches. Goodbye.